The city of Oakhaven was a ceaseless, indifferent hum, a sprawling concrete beast that devoured individual lives whole. For David Miller, his existence within its vast maw was largely invisible. He was one of the countless cogs in its intricate machinery, a ghost in the urban landscape. His days unfolded with a monotonous predictability. The drone of ceaseless traffic outside his small, rented room, the flickering, sickly yellow glow of the fluorescent lights in the cramped office where he processed invoices, and the bitter taste of stale, lukewarm coffee that stained his chipped mug. He moved through his life in a quiet daze, performing a low-wage, unfulfilling job. His interactions with the outside world minimal, devoid of strong connections or meaningful engagements. His evenings were a mirror of his days. He would return to his tiny apartment, the air heavy with the scent of recycled air and old dust. He'd prepare his solitary dinner, usually a microwaved meal, its plastic tray rattling faintly as it spun in the oven. He'd eat in silence, the only company the muted sounds of the city seeping through his thin walls and the flickering images of the evening news on his small, outdated television. He watched the headlines flash, the dramas of the world unfold, without truly engaging, a passive observer in his own life. The silence stretched, sometimes for hours, punctuated only by the occasional clatter of cutlery from a distant neighbor or the faint siren wail disappearing into the urban tapestry. It was a life lived on the fringes, devoid of strong anchors, a quiet existence defined by its very lack of definition. He tried, sometimes, to break through the invisible wall that surrounded him. At work, he'd attempt to make conversation with his colleagues, offering a hesitant comment about the weather or a recent news story. Their responses were always polite, but firm in their disinterest, their gazes sliding past him as if he were merely part of the office furniture. In his building, a hurried nod in the hallway was the most he could expect from his neighbors, their lives too busy, too self-contained, to notice the quiet man on the third floor. David yearned for connection, for a voice that truly heard his own, but his timid nature, coupled with years of being overlooked, had built a formidable barrier around him. He felt, deep down, a sense of innate decency, a quiet belief in fairness. But the world around him rarely offered an opportunity for these qualities to shine. One unusually warm Tuesday evening, as dusk bled across the Oakhaven skyline, painting the concrete towers in hues of gray and orange, David was walking home from his job at a dreary accounting firm. He preferred to walk, allowing the anonymity of the crowded sidewalks to envelop him. As he passed the bustling marketplace district, a cacophony of vendors hawking their wares filled the air. His attention was drawn to a small, brightly colored stall, selling artisanal jams and freshly baked bread. Behind the counter stood Maria, a gruff but kind-faced woman with flour dusting her apron and a hearty laugh that usually boomed across the square. Today, however, her face was strained, her usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a look of bewildered frustration. Standing opposite her, arms crossed and a smug smirk plastered on his face, was a city inspector. The man was a caricature of petty authority, immaculately pressed uniform, gleaming badge, and an air of self-importance that seemed to swell his already ample frame. He was lecturing Maria, his voice loud enough to draw curious glances from passers-by. And as per Section 3B, Subsection 7, Paragraph 2 of the Municipal Vendor Ordinances, the inspector droned, pointing a thick finger at a small, almost invisible crack in Maria's wooden stall. This constitutes a structural hazard. Furthermore, your display permit, while technically valid, fails to account for the slight protrusion of your awning beyond the designated 9-foot boundary. These are serious infractions. Madam, serious indeed. You're looking at a minimum fine of 500 credits per violation and immediate cessation of operations. Maria wrung her hands, her face paling. 500. But it's just a tiny crack. And the awning, it's barely an inch over. I'm a small business, Your Eyes, sir. I can't afford this. The inspector merely smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Rules are rules, madam. Ignorance of the law is no excuse. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to dispute this in court, which, I assure you, would involve far greater costs. He produced a citation book, pen poised. David, who had stopped a few yards away, felt a familiar surge of helpless indignation. It was a clear case of excessive force, of a powerful bureaucrat preying on a small, vulnerable individual. His timid nature urged him to keep walking, to mind his own business, but something within him, a deep, quiet sense of justice, stirred. He thought of Maria's kind face, the scent of her fresh bread, the small moments of warmth she brought to the otherwise indifferent city. He couldn't just stand by. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. His voice, usually a whisper, gained a surprising clarity. "Excuse me, officer," he said, the words feeling alien on his tongue. The inspector, annoyed at the interruption, turned, his smirk hardening. "And who are you?" "Civilian. This is official city business." "I apologize, yes, sir," David continued, his hands clasped nervously in front of him, but his gaze steady. "But I believe you might be misinterpreting the code regarding minor structural anomalies and temporary fixture protrusions for vendors, if I recall correctly. Section 3.b, subsection 7, paragraph 2 specifically refers to permanent structural components and fixed display installations." He paused, taking a breath. "For temporary structures, such as this vendor stall, the relevant code is section 4c, paragraph 9, which states that minor cosmetic damage, not directly impacting structural integrity or public safety, shall be subject to a warning for first offense, or a maximum fine of 50 credits, at the discretion of the inspecting officer, and for the awning, if it is indeed temporary and easily adjustable, as Maria's appears to be. Then subsection 12A of the same code allows for a verbal warning and a 24-hour rectification period before any fine can be levied." The inspector's smugness began to falter. He stared at David, then at his citation book, then back at David. His eyes narrowed in confusion. He flipped through pages, his brow furrowed. He was clearly trying to bluff, to intimidate, but David's quiet, logical arguments, delivered with an almost academic precision, had hit a nerve. He had quoted specific code numbers, something few ordinary citizens bothered to do. Maria, who had been staring at David with a mixture of confusion and dawning hope, looked from David to the flustered inspector, a flicker of surprise and dawning respect in her eyes. "And," David added, sensing the inspector's hesitation, "if the intent of the violation is not malicious, and the vendor demonstrates immediate willingness to comply, the code typically favors educational warnings over punitive fines, especially for small businesses operating within community-approved zones. It's in the spirit of fair commerce. Wouldn't you say, sir?" The inspector slammed his citation book shut. His face was a thundercloud of irritation and embarrassment. He knew he had been outmaneuvered, not by aggression, but by quiet, undeniable logic. All right, enough of your legal mumbo-jumbo. Fine, consider it a warning. Madam," he glared at Maria, then at David, "but I'll be back. And next time, don't think your lawyer friend here can save you." He stalked off, his heavy boots echoing on the pavement, his indignation a palpable aura. Maria stared at Elias, her mouth slightly agape. My goodness. How did you... Thank you. You saved me. I don't know how I can ever repay you." Her gruff exterior softened, replaced by a deep, genuine gratitude. David felt a warmth spread through him, a rare, unfamiliar sensation of quiet accomplishment. It was nothing. Maria just wanted to help. He offered a small, shy smile. Then, as the last of the curious onlookers dispersed, he quickly retreated into the anonymity of the passing crowd, his save the cat moment completed, leaving Maria with a bewildered but deeply grateful expression. As David continued his walk home, the encounter replayed in his mind. He wasn't sure where those specific code numbers had come from, or how he had remembered them with such clarity. It felt almost instinctive, like a forgotten language suddenly bubbling to the surface. He reached his small apartment, the air still, the hum of the city a distant thrum. He paused by a dusty bookshelf in his living room, a relic from his brief, ill-fated attempt at higher education years ago. Most of the books were untouched, forgotten, but one, a single, unopened volume with a stark black cover, stood out. It was a textbook on constitutional law, a vague, youthful curiosity he'd bought on a whim and never read, shoved onto the shelf and forgotten for years. He pulled it out, its weight surprising him. The pages were crisp, pristine. He idly flipped through it, his thumb catching on a section detailing due process and evidentiary rules. He paused, his eyes lingering on a complex flowchart illustrating the appeals process, a seemingly insurmountable maze of boxes and arrows. It looked daunting, intricate, and utterly irrelevant to his life, a relic from a path he had never taken. Yet, as he traced the lines with his finger, he felt a strange, almost magnetic pull. A small, almost imperceptible spark ignited within him, a hint of a latent intelligence, a keen analytical mind that had been lying dormant for far too long. He placed the book back on the shelf, the faint hum of the city outside providing the only soundtrack to his quiet, unacknowledged moment of self-discovery. The dull metallic clang of the bailiff's gavel reverberated through the sterile courtroom, sealing David Miller's fate. Guilty. The word, delivered without inflection by the presiding judge, felt like a physical blow, shattering the fragile glass of David's quiet existence. He stood there, a solitary figure at the defense table, his heart hammering against his ribs, his mind reeling. The air in the room, thick with the scent of old paper and nervous sweat, suddenly felt impossibly heavy, suffocating him. He barely registered the murmurs from the small public gallery, or the satisfied nod of prosecutor Eleanor Vance, a woman whose ambition gleamed as brightly as her perfectly coiffed hair. David had been inexplicably implicated in a petty theft that occurred near his workplace, a small, unassuming antique clock. A sentimental but not particularly valuable item had vanished from the lobby. The evidence against him was flimsy, circumstantial at best, a blurry security camera image showing a figure with a similar build leaving the building around the time of the theft, and the unfortunate coincidence of David having worked late that night. There was no direct proof, no clear motive. But in the bustling, impersonal city of Oak Haven, where efficiency often trumped thoroughness, the authorities had latched onto the easiest narrative. Prosecutor Vance, a rising star in the district attorney's office, saw David's case as a simple, open and shut affair, an easy win to bolster her already impressive conviction record. She was a master of rhetoric, painting David as a shadowy, desperate figure. His quiet demeanor spun into an insidious cunning. His pleas of innocence, delivered in a voice barely above a whisper, were easily dismissed as weak prevarications. The public defender assigned to David, a weary man named Mr. Harrison, was overworked and disengaged, a cog in the overloaded machinery of justice. His eyes held the perpetual fatigue of too many cases, too few resources. He had met with David only briefly, his advice blunt and devoid of hope. Take the plea bargain, Mr. Miller. It's a misdemeanor. A few months, maybe a year. Fighting this will only get you more time. The system moves fast. You don't want to get caught in its gears. He had seen hundreds like David, quiet, unremarkable men swallowed whole by a system that prized expediency over individual truth. David had felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness, a profound despair. His timid nature, which had always kept him on the fringes, now threatened to undo him completely. He was adrift in a cold, indifferent system he didn't understand, a labyrinth of legal jargon and unspoken rules. But beneath the fear, a fierce, burning indignation began to flicker. It was a small, persistent flame, kindled by the sheer, unadulterated injustice of it all. How could this be happening? How could a man be condemned for something he didn't do, simply because it was convenient? "I didn't do it," David had whispered to Mr. Harrison during a brief recess, his voice raw with desperation. "I was in the break room, getting coffee. I saw no one." Mr. Harrison merely sighed, running a hand over his thinning hair. "You don't have an alibi, Mr. Miller. No witnesses. The camera footage, it's enough for a jury. Take the deal." But Elias couldn't. He couldn't stomach the idea of admitting to a crime he hadn't committed. The thought of that false confession tainting his already unremarkable life was a deeper torment than any prison sentence. This wasn't just a legal problem. It was a personal assault on his dignity, his quiet life, and his very fundamental sense of justice. It was a betrayal of his inner truth. This experience, the crushing weight of false accusation, awakened a dormant resilience within him, a desperate, almost primal need for self-preservation and, more importantly, vindication. He rejected the plea bargain, a quiet act of defiance that surprised even Mr. Harrison. "No," David had said, his voice clearer than it had been in years. "I'm innocent. I want to fight this." Mr. Harrison merely shrugged, a weary gesture of resignation. "Suit yourself, Mr. Miller, but don't say I didn't warn you." The trial was a blur of legal formalities and incomprehensible jargon. David's defense, presented by the visibly unenthusiastic Mr. Harrison, was half-hearted, lacking conviction. Prosecutor Vance, on the other hand, was sharp, relentless, painting a picture of calculated deceit that was utterly foreign to David's nature. The jury, swayed by the prosecutor's confident narrative and the circumstantial evidence, delivered their swift verdict. The judge, without emotion, delivered the sentence a significant term in Blackwood Penitentiary, a high-security facility known for its harsh conditions and its reputation as a place where hope went to die. David's world tilted on its axis. The quiet, predictable hum of Oakhaven was replaced by a profound, chilling silence, the silence of a man facing the abrupt end of everything he knew. The journey to Blackwood was a blur of confinement. He was shackled, stripped of his few personal belongings, and driven in a windowless van through a landscape that seemed to grow increasingly bleak. The air, once familiar city grit, now carried the sterile, metallic tang of institutional confinement. And then, the clang. The heavy steel door of his cell slammed shut behind him with a resonant, terrifying finality. The sound echoed in the tiny, concrete box, a brutal punctuation mark to his freedom. The fluorescent lights overhead, unlike the familiar flickering ones of his old room, cast a harsh, unforgiving glare, illuminating every crack in the paint, every stain on the floor. The cold reality of prison life descended upon him with crushing weight. The constant hum of distant machinery, the shouts of guards, the muffled cries of other inmates. It was a cacophony of despair, utterly unlike the familiar, indifferent hum of the city. He stood in his cell, a rectangular void, stripped of his few rights, stripped of his identity as David Miller, invoice clerk, and reduced to inmate 743. His clothes had been replaced by the drab, coarse uniform of the prison, the small, metal-framed bed, the bolted-down toilet, the single, narrow window high on the wall that offered only a sliver of gray sky. This was his new reality. There was no going back to his quiet life outside. That life had been ripped from him, replaced by the grim, unyielding walls of Blackwood. He had crossed the point of no return. He was a prisoner, utterly alone, facing a future he never imagined. He had to adapt, to find a way to survive, or he would be crushed by the sheer unyielding force of this new, brutal existence. The battle for his innocence had not ended with the judge's gavel. It had merely begun, within the cold, unforgiving confines of Blackwood Penitentiary. The stark reality of Blackwood Penitentiary was a constant, grinding assault on the senses. The clang of steel doors, the shouts of guards, the cacophony of hundreds of desperate men echoing through the concrete corridors. It was a brutal symphony of confinement. David Miller. Now just inmate 743 navigated this new terrifying world with the same quiet, observational nature that had characterized his life outside, but with a sharpened intensity born of desperation. He saw the subtle hierarchies, the unspoken rules, and, most painfully, the pervasive injustice that permeated every aspect of prison life. He witnessed it daily, the arbitrary punishments, the overlooked medical needs, the despair in the eyes of men who had been swallowed by a system that seemed designed to crush hope. He saw how the legal system, outside, had been a labyrinth. Inside, it was a dark, impenetrable wall. Many inmates, even those with clear cases for appeal, simply gave up, their spirits broken by endless bureaucracy and the exorbitant cost of legal representation. It was an older inmate named Silas, a gentle giant with a kind face etched with years of hardship, who particularly caught David's attention. Silas was a man of quiet dignity, respected by even the hardened few, a surprising island of calm in the chaotic sea of Blackwood. He had been wrongly accused of a serious crime, a robbery that had turned violent, a crime Silas vehemently denied committing. His pro bono lawyer, a sharp-suited, arrogant man named Mr. Thorne, who handled multiple prison cases, had met with Silas only a handful of times, always with a dismissive air. Thorne had just delivered the crushing news Silas's crucial appeal had been denied, ostensibly due to a missed filing deadline. Silas had slumped against the wall of the common room, his large frame trembling, his eyes holding the vacant stare of a man who had finally lost all hope. He knew he was innocent, but the system had simply chewed him up and spit him out. David, watching Silas's profound despair, felt a familiar surge of indignant rage. It was the same feeling that had made him step in to help Maria, the street vendor. But this was different. This was life and death, freedom and perpetual confinement. He knew Silas was innocent, and he also knew, with a chilling certainty, that the justice system, having failed him personally, was now failing Silas. He approached Silas cautiously during yard time, when the noise provided a measure of privacy. "Silas," David said, his voice hesitant, I heard about your appeal. I'm sorry." Silas merely grunted, staring at the barren concrete. "Doesn't matter, kid. System wants you in. You stay in. Lawyers are all the same. Just a bunch of talkers taking your last dime." But a missed deadline. David pressed, a thought beginning to form in his mind. That seems odd. Lawyers usually track those things meticulously. He remembered the complex flowcharts in his unopened constitutional law textbook, the myriad rules governing appeals. Silas scoffed. "Thorne said it was a clerical error. Said it happens. Said I was lucky it wasn't worse." Something about that didn't sit right with David. He had an innate, almost instinctive grasp of patterns, of things that didn't quite fit. He decided, then and there, that he had to act. He had no formal training, no legal standing, but he had time, a keen mind, and a burning sense of justice. His journey into law began in the prison library, a dreary room filled with outdated texts and the hushed murmurs of desperate men. He spent every allowed hour there, poring over legal statutes, deciphering arcane jargon, trying to understand the intricate machinery of the law. He devoured dusty volumes on criminal procedure, evidentiary rules, and appellate law, his previously latent intelligence, the quiet analytical mind that had once deciphered obscure municipal codes, now blossomed with astonishing speed. He found himself drawn to the logical elegance of legal arguments, the meticulous pursuit of truth through documentation and precedent. It felt less like rote memorization and more like solving a complex, vital puzzle. He asked Silas for his case documents, the thin folder that represented years of his life. As David meticulously read through them, a glaring procedural error jumped out at him. Mr. Thorne, Silas's lawyer, had indeed missed a crucial, mandatory motion filing. Not just a deadline for the appeal itself, but a preliminary motion that, according to a statute David unearthed from a forgotten casebook, was a prerequisite for certain types of appeal. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a fundamental oversight, a clear case of negligence. Furthermore, buried deep within the police report, David found a minor inconsistency in a witness statement that, while seemingly insignificant, could entirely dismantle the prosecution's timeline. David approached Silas again, his voice now imbued with a newfound authority. "Silas, Mr. Thorne didn't just miss a deadline. He failed to file a necessary preliminary motion, and I found an inconsistency in the witness testimony that could be crucial. It's a clear error of counsel. We can fight this." Silas, initially skeptical, listened with a mixture of bewilderment and a flicker of disbelief. He had given up hope, but as David, meticulously, patiently, laid out his arguments, quoting specific statutes and case precedents he had uncovered, Silas's eyes widened. David didn't boast. He simply presented the facts. Compelled by the undeniable logic of the law and his deep empathy for Silas's plight, he offered advice, not to show off, but out of a desperate need to see justice done. You found that," Silas whispered, clutching the faded documents. "In a few days, my lawyer, he had months." Their conversations, initially covert, became more frequent. David helped Silas draft motions, explained legal concepts in simple terms, and prepared him for the complex questions he might face. He was learning, not just theory, but the gritty, practical application of the law, driven by the stark reality of their shared confinement. Unbeknownst to them, their unusual activity had attracted the attention of Warden Thorne, no relation to Mr. Thorne, the lawyer, the cynical and corrupt figure who lorded over Blackwood Penitentiary. Warden Thorne was a man who thrived on control and secrecy. He cultivated an image of strict order, but beneath it lay a vast network of illicit operations kickbacks from commissary suppliers, manipulation of inmate records to deny parole or appeals, and a casual disregard for inmate rights that ensured a constant flow of cheap labor for prison industries. He saw any inmate who showed too much intelligence, too much initiative, as a threat to his carefully constructed empire of injustice. Warden Thorne had his network of snitches and his watchful, unblinking surveillance cameras. He had received reports of inmate 743, the quiet clerk, spending unusual amounts of time in the library, poring over law books, and engaging in hushed conversations with Silas. This wasn't the behavior of a broken man. It was the behavior of someone seeking leverage, someone trying to unravel the threads of his control. A flicker of suspicious interest ignited in the warden's cold eyes. He began to subtly move against David. First, David's access to the legal library became erratic, filled with sudden maintenance closures. Then, his allocated time with Silas was mysteriously cut short. Guards, previously indifferent, now watched David with a new, unsettling intensity. Warden Thorne also spread carefully crafted rumors among the other inmates, painting David as a delusional troublemaker, a snitch trying to stir things up, subtly isolating him from potential allies. He publicly dismissed David as a fool playing lawyer, his voice dripping with condescension during daily announcements, hoping to crush David's spirit and undermine his credibility. But these subtle acts of aggression, rather than breaking David, only solidified his resolve. The injustice he faced, and the injustice he witnessed, fueled his determination. He knew he was on the right path. Silas, witnessing the warden's increasing hostility towards David, felt a renewed, albeit fragile, hope. He saw David's unwavering spirit, his quiet dedication. Silas, in turn, became David's first quiet supporter, his unwavering ngoi tro gyup. He began to subtly smuggle in outside legal information, notes from family visits, old newspaper clippings relevant to Silas's case, acting as David's eyes and ears to the outside world, a clandestine network of justice forming within the very walls designed to suppress it. The battle for Silas's freedom, and for David's own vindication, had truly begun. The news rippled through Blackwood Penitentiary like a whispered legend. Silas, the quiet giant, had been granted an appeal. It was a rare victory, a fleeting spark of hope in the pervasive gloom of the prison. For most inmates, an appeal was a distant, unreachable dream, swallowed by bureaucracy or the sheer weight of legal fees. This breakthrough, engineered by the unassuming inmate 743 David Miller, sent a tremor through the established order. It was a direct challenge to Warden Thorne's iron-fisted control, a crack in the facade of his unassailable authority. The date for Silas's appeal hearing was set, not in a grand formal courtroom, but within the grim confines of Blackwood itself. A makeshift courtroom was set up in the prison's bleak, oppressive visitation room. This room, usually a sterile space for brief, strained encounters between inmates and their dwindling connections to the outside world, where fleeting hopes were often crushed by the weight of reality and goodbyes carried the sting of prolonged separation, now became the symbolic arena for David's ultimate test. It was a stage where justice was routinely bent, where truth was often obscured, and where hope was systematically crushed under the heel of systemic corruption. The air, usually thick with the scent of stale disinfectant and unspoken despair, now hummed with a different kind of tension, a nervous energy that transcended the usual prison routine. The judge assigned to the appeal, a stoic, silver-haired man named Judge Eldridge, was known to be an old friend and frequent golf partner of Warden Thorne, a clear sign that the scales of justice were already heavily tipped. David, despite the growing, fearful admiration of other inmates who looked to him as an improbable beacon of defiance, knew he faced this formidable legal challenge almost entirely alone. Silas's quiet support was a lifeline, a moral anchor in the turbulent waters of the prison system. But in the formal setting of the makeshift courtroom, David would have no co-counsel, no legal team to confer with, no research assistants to cross-reference precedents. He was a self-taught legal scholar, battling against a seasoned prosecutor and a biased judge, all within the warden's own fortress. He knew that if he failed, Silas's last chance at freedom would be extinguished forever, and for David himself, the consequences would be dire. He would face severe retribution from Warden Thorne, losing not just his newfound purpose, but potentially his access to the very legal resources he needed for his own simmering case. The weight of Silas's life, and the precariousness of his own, rested squarely on his shoulders. Warden Thorne, a man whose control was absolute, was determined to crush David. He saw this appeal not just as a challenge to Silas's conviction, but as a direct affront to his authority, a dangerous precedent that could undermine his entire operation. He ramped up his campaign of psychological warfare against David, meticulously designed to break his spirit and sabotage his efforts. The first blow came subtly. David's access to the prison library, previously sporadic, was now almost completely cut off. Maintenance issues, the guards would sneer, blocking his path. His request forms for legal texts were lost or misplaced. He was forced to rely on his memory, on the few dog-eared pages Silas managed to smuggle in, and on the sparse, hastily scribbled notes he had managed to make. Next, Warden Thorne began to limit David's time with Silas. Their brief, furtive meetings in the common room were now constantly interrupted, their conversations monitored with unsettling intensity. Guards would hover, listening in, their presence a palpable barrier to any meaningful discussion. David was forced to communicate through coded whispers, through a series of subtle gestures and shared glances that only Silas could understand. A desperate dance of forbidden legal counsel. The psychological pressure escalated. Warden Thorne planted false, intimidating rumors among the inmates. Miller's a snitch, working for the warden to expose weakness. He's just playing lawyer to get special privileges, leaving you all to rot. He wanted to isolate David, to turn the very people David sought to help against him, undermining his credibility and eroding the fragile trust he had built. He even arranged for minor accidents, a spilled tray of food, a loosened floorboard in David's cell, designed to disrupt his focus and remind him of the warden's omnipresent power. Then came the most crushing blow, a calculated move to cripple David's preparations. The legal deadline for the appeal brief was moved up, unexpectedly and without clear justification. "Clerical error," a guard stated flatly when David questioned it, a sneer twisting his lips. This meant David had only a fraction of the time he had anticipated to complete the crucial legal document. He now had to work with extreme urgency. Every minute precious, every second a race against the clock. In the tiny, cramped confines of his cell, often by the dim light filtered through the small window, David toiled. He meticulously crafted complex legal arguments, weaving together obscure case precedents with Silas's fragmented memories and his own sharp observations. He used the backs of old commissary lists, scraps of toilet paper, anything he could find, to scribble notes, diagram timelines, and outline his points. He prepared Silas for every conceivable cross-examination question, drilling him on his alibi, on the inconsistencies in the police report, on the procedural errors that had tainted his original trial. Their conversations, though limited, became intense, focused sessions of strategic planning. The pressure was relentless. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking guard. Every quiet moment felt like an invitation for a cell search, a confiscation of his contraband legal materials. The constant surveillance was a heavy weight, and the warden's escalating hostility was a chilling reminder of the consequences of failure. The ticking clock on Silas's appeal, synchronized with the unyielding presence of Warden Thorne, created a desperate, solitary race against time. Elias felt the full, crushing weight of the system pressing down on him, trying to break him, to make him surrender. But the injustice he had witnessed, and the quiet dignity of Silas, fueled a fire within him, a determination to fight, not just for freedom, but for truth. This was his gauntlet, and he would not falter. The makeshift courtroom in Blackwood Penitentiary's visitation room hummed with a tense, suffocating silence. The air, usually thick with the faint scent of stale coffee and desperation, now crackled with a palpable undercurrent of anticipation and dread. Judge Eldridge, his silver hair impeccably combed, sat on the raised dais, his expression stern, his eyes occasionally flicking towards Warden Thorne, who sat at the prosecutor's table, a smug, confident smirk playing on his lips. The few inmates allowed to observe, mostly Silas's closest confidants, sat huddled in the back, their faces etched with a desperate, fragile hope. The atmosphere was heavily biased against Silas, a palpable weight of institutional power pressing down on David Miller, the self-taught lawyer. The prosecution, represented by a slick, condescending prison lawyer named Mr. Davies, chosen specifically by Warden Thorne for his aggressive, no-holds-barred approach, presented their case with a practiced ease. He reiterated the flimsy evidence, painting Silas as a hardened criminal despite his gentle demeanor, and subtly hinting at David's disruptive presence in the prison. He leaned back, a picture of confident authority, as if the verdict were already predetermined. David, though nervous, rose from his chair. His hands, usually trembling in moments of stress, were steady. He didn't deliver a flowery speech, no soaring rhetoric designed to stir emotion. Instead, he spoke with a quiet, methodical precision, his voice clear and unwavering, resonating with a calm authority that seemed to fill the sterile room. He began to dissect the prosecution's flimsy evidence, piece by painstaking piece, like a surgeon meticulously unwrapping a complex wound. He started with the initial police report, pointing out inconsistencies in witness testimonies that had been overlooked or deliberately ignored. "Your Honor," David began, his voice calm, "the eyewitness, Mr. Henderson, states in his original report that the assailant wore a dark-hooded sweatshirt. However, a later, unfiled addendum, obtained through court order, states he recalled the assailant wore a light gray jacket. A minor detail, perhaps, but one that creates reasonable doubt regarding identification, especially given the poor lighting conditions at the time of the alleged crime. He then moved to the supposed physical evidence. The prosecution presented a single, blurry fingerprint found at the scene. My research, however, reveals that this print was lifted from a surface that, according to the crime scene photos, was exposed to significant foot traffic. Furthermore, the print itself is partial and smudged, deemed insufficient for positive identification by the initial forensic report, a detail conspicuously absent from the prosecution's summary. He then quoted obscure case law he had painstakingly memorized from outdated legal volumes, citing precedents where similar, flimsy evidence had been successfully challenged. He drew upon Miranda v. Arizona for a point on Silas's initial questioning, and a rarely cited ruling from Commonwealth v. Jennings regarding the chain of custody for evidence. Warden Thorne, who had been listening with a bored expression, began to shift uncomfortably. Mr. Davies, the prosecutor, frowned, his confident smirk faltering. David then turned to the most damaging aspect of Silas's original conviction, his alibi. Silas Jenkins, my client, maintained from the outset that he was at the public library at the time of the alleged crime. His public defender, Mr. Thorne, failed to pursue this alibi. However, through diligent, albeit challenging, investigation from within these walls, we have obtained library records indicating Silas checked out 2 books at 7:17 p.m. on the night in question, a full hour after the alleged theft took place. Furthermore, a statement from a librarian, obtained recently, confirms Silas's presence. He presented a meticulously crafted timeline, cross-referencing prison logs with the library's records, proving Silas's physical impossibility of having committed the crime. His calm, logical delivery, combined with the irrefutable facts he presented, slowly began to dismantle the prosecution's case. He exposed how crucial evidence had been mishandled, how witness testimonies were contradictory, and how Silas's original lawyer, Mr. Thorne, had been demonstrably negligent, failing to pursue obvious avenues of defense. David did not raise his voice. He simply laid bare the truth, piece by undeniable piece. Judge Eldridge, initially sneering, slowly began to look uncomfortable. His gaze flickered from David, so unassuming yet so devastatingly effective, to Warden Thorne, whose face was beginning to pale. The prison guards, initially bored or openly contemptuous, leaned forward in their seats, their expressions shifting from apathy to grudging respect, then to outright shock as the intricate web of deceit and incompetence began to unravel before their very eyes. Silas, who had been resigned to his fate, his eyes downcast, now watched David with growing wonder, then tears of profound, overwhelming hope. The prosecutor, Mr. Davies, seeing his case crumbling, whispered frantically to Warden Thorne. Then, with a theatrical flourish, he announced, "Your Honor, the prosecution has just received a new, critical piece of evidence. A surprise witness has come forward, claiming to have seen Silas Jenkins fleeing the scene. This testimony will unequivocally prove the defendant's guilt and discredit his dubious alibi." The room held its breath. It seemed all was lost, a desperate last-ditch effort to railroad Silas. The few inmates in the back gasped, their hope evaporating. Warden Thorne's smug smirk returned, a triumphant glint in his eyes. David, however, maintained his composure. He remembered every detail of prison regulations, every obscure legal precedent, every piece of information Silas had managed to smuggle in. He listened intently as the surprise witness, a nervous, shifty-eyed inmate brought in by the warden's guards, delivered a seemingly damning testimony. But as the witness spoke, David immediately recognized a subtle inconsistency in the testimony's wording, a phrase that directly contradicted a fundamental prison regulation he had memorized regarding inmate movement and restricted areas. The witness claimed to have seen Silas in a specific part of the prison yard at a time when, according to the regulation, that area was under mandatory lockdown. David calmly raised his hand. "Your Honor, I object. This testimony is a fabrication. It contradicts Prison Regulation 17C. Subsection 4 concerning daily yard lockdown protocols. The witness claims to have seen my client in an area that was under mandatory inmate restriction at the exact time of the alleged sighting. He pulled a crumpled, smuggled copy of the prison regulations from his pocket, holding it up for the judge to see. Judge Eldridge, visibly rattled by David's quick thinking and undeniable factual challenge, slammed his gavel. Objection sustained, Mr. Davies. Do you have any explanation for this discrepancy? Mr. Davies stammered, his face turning an angry red. Warden Thorne, his face contorted in a mixture of fury and disbelief, slammed his fist on the table, a sound that echoed through the room. His carefully orchestrated plan, his attempt to publicly discredit David, had backfired spectacularly. The judge, his composure visibly cracking, called for a brief recess. When court resumed, attention heavier than before hung in the air. Judge Eldridge, his voice strained, cleared his throat. He looked at Silas, then at David, his gaze lingering on the self-taught lawyer. He looked at the mountain of irrefutable evidence David had presented, the glaring procedural errors, the fabricated testimony. There was no escaping the truth. Given the compelling new evidence presented by Mr. Miller, Judge Eldridge began, his voice devoid of its earlier bias, and the systemic irregularities in the initial prosecution of Mr. Silas Jenkins, this court finds itself compelled to reassess. He paused, taking a long, visible breath. Based on the evidence before me, this court finds Mr. Silas Jenkins not guilty on all counts. He is to be released from Blackwood Penitentiary immediately. A stunned silence filled the room. Then, a collective gasp from the few inmates allowed to witness, followed by a raw, guttural sob from Silas himself. He stared at David, his eyes brimming with tears of overwhelming relief and gratitude. Warden Thorne, his face a mask of incandescent rage and utter defeat, slowly, menacingly, rose from his seat, but was restrained by a junior officer who had clearly seen which way the wind was blowing. David, though physically exhausted, his mind drained, stood tall, his quiet victory a profound, undeniable moment of vindication. Justice, against all odds, had been served, forged in the crucible of his own incarceration. The reverberations of Silas Jenkins's acquittal shook the very foundations of Blackwood Penitentiary and echoed far beyond its grim walls. News of the unexpected verdict, delivered by a self-taught inmate lawyer, spread like wildfire through the city's legal and journalistic circles. It wasn't merely a minor case. It was a glaring indictment of systemic failure, a beacon of hope for the unjustly incarcerated, and, most damningly for him, a direct threat to Warden Thorne's illicit empire. The quiet victory inside the makeshift courtroom blossomed into a public outcry, fueled by the relentless reporting of journalists eager to expose the truth. An independent investigation was immediately launched into Blackwood Penitentiary, prompted by the public's outrage and the undeniable irregularities in Silas's case. David, now a free man, no longer inmate 743, found himself at the heart of this inquiry. He cooperated fully, providing meticulous documentation of Silas's wrongful conviction. Every detail he had meticulously gathered while inside, the missed preliminary motion, the inconsistent witness testimony, the fabricated evidence, the precise dates and times of Warden Thorne's subtle acts of sabotage against his legal preparations, now became irrefutable evidence. He even provided dates and times of specific cell searches that conveniently misplaced legal documents, and the names of guards involved in restricting his library access. His quiet observation, once a means of survival, became a devastating weapon for justice. Warden Thorne, who had reveled in his absolute control, watched his empire crumble. The investigation quickly unearthed a mountain of incriminating evidence: doctored inmate records, suspiciously large financial transactions, anonymous tips from disillusioned prison staff, and testimony from previously intimidated inmates who, emboldened by Silas's freedom, now dared to speak out. Thorne's network of corruption, so carefully constructed, unraveled at an astonishing pace. He was arrested, charged with a litany of crimes including obstruction of justice, embezzlement, and abuse of power. His reign of terror over Blackwood Penitentiary ended not with a defiant roar, but with the quiet click of handcuffs. He was destined for a long prison sentence, a bitter irony for the man who had profited from the very system he now faced. The biased Judge Eldridge, implicated in the scandal due to his clear relationship with Thorne and his initial reluctance to acknowledge David's evidence, resigned in disgrace, his reputation shattered. David, walking out of Blackwood a free man, felt the raw, crisp air on his face like a miracle. He was no longer just an innocent man released. He was hailed as a champion of justice, an improbable hero who had navigated the depths of injustice and emerged victorious. His story, a testament to resilience and the power of the human spirit, captivated the nation. Offers began to pour in, a deluge of opportunities from legal firms, universities, and civil rights organizations eager to harness his unique talent. He was offered a full scholarship to Oakhaven University Law School, a prestigious institution that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. The dean himself, recognizing the extraordinary talent David possessed, personally reached out, emphasizing that his real-world experience was worth more than any textbook education. Simultaneously, prominent civil rights organizations offered him immediate pro bono work opportunities, eager for him to lend his formidable skills to their ongoing battles against systemic injustice. This wasn't just about personal freedom. It was a profound chance to transform his newfound passion for law into a powerful tool for systemic change, to ensure that what happened to him and Silas would happen to fewer others. David chose to pursue his legal education while simultaneously embarking on a high-profile case involving other wrongly imprisoned inmates he had met during his time inside. He believed that true learning came from application, from fighting for justice on the ground. He declined lucrative corporate law offers, choosing instead to dedicate himself to those who had been failed by the very system he had come to understand so intimately. Weeks later, David and Silas met in a quiet, sun-dappled park in Oakhaven, a world away from the steel and concrete of Blackwood. Silas, thinner but with a newfound lightness in his eyes, had begun the slow process of rebuilding his life, reconnecting with family he thought he'd lost forever. He looked at David, his face filled with a profound, almost spiritual gratitude. "David," Silas said, his voice thick with emotion, "I owe you everything. You gave me back my life, my freedom." David, though still quiet, met Silas's gaze with a steady calm. "You gave me something too, Silas. You gave me a purpose, a reason to fight." He paused, looking around at the lush greenery of the park, a stark contrast to the barren yard of Blackwood. Being inside, it showed me the raw, ugly truth of the system. How many voices are silenced, how many lives are crushed, simply because they don't know the rules or don't have the means to fight. Silas nodded, a grim understanding in his eyes. "They don't want you to know. They want you to stay quiet, to accept your fate." "Exactly," David replied, a flicker of his newfound steel in his voice. "And that's why I have to fight. For those who have no voice, for those who are still caught in that maze. My own experience, it taught me the rules, the loopholes, the cracks in their armor. I want to use that." He reached into his bag, pulling out a thick, well-worn copy of his constitutional law textbook. It was no longer unopened. Its pages were now filled with his own meticulous annotations, underlined passages, and countless dog-eared corners. "This," David said, holding up the book. "This is my weapon now. I learned it the hard way, but I learned it, and I'm going to make sure others have the chance to learn it too, so they can fight for themselves." He looked at Silas, a sense of deep resolve settling over him. "This is just the beginning. Silas, this is the new calm, before the next storm we face, for justice." Their conversation, A quiet exchange between two men forever changed by their shared ordeal, cemented a bond born of injustice and forged in defiance. David, the timid clerk, had found his true calling, a formidable advocate for those without hope. The prison, meant to break him, had instead become the crucible of his transformation, turning him into an unexpected champion of justice, a living testament to the fact that even in the darkest of places, the light of truth can emerge triumphant. 5 years later, the name David Miller resonated with quiet power throughout the legal world, a stark contrast to the anonymity that had once defined his life. He was no longer just the man who had been jailed for a minor crime. He was a respected and highly successful civil rights attorney, a relentless advocate for justice, particularly for those failed by a system he knew intimately. His office, located in a bustling yet understated building in Oak Haven, was not opulent, but functional. Its walls lined with shelves overflowing with legal texts, case files, and, most importantly, countless letters of gratitude from clients whose lives he had helped reclaim. He had specialized in post-conviction relief and prison reform, his sharp mind and meticulous research overturning wrongful convictions that seasoned lawyers had deemed impossible. He thrived not in the cutthroat corporate world, but in the challenging, deeply rewarding arena of social justice, his quiet passion burning brighter than any ambition for wealth or fame. His days were long, filled with court appearances, depositions, and painstaking research, but every hour was infused with purpose. He was known for his sharp mind, his uncanny ability to dissect complex legal arguments, and his unwavering commitment to his clients, many of whom were marginalized individuals who had been failed, exploited, or simply forgotten by the system. He built his reputation not on aggressive theatrics, but on undeniable logic, rigorous evidence, and a profound empathy for those he represented. He became a beacon of hope for many, a quiet force for change in a world that often seemed stacked against the vulnerable. David, however, never forgot the crucible that had forged him. The grim reality of Blackwood Penitentiary, the pervasive injustice he had witnessed, and the quiet despair of its inmates remained etched in his memory, a constant reminder of why he fought. This personal experience became the bedrock of his most impactful initiative, the establishment of the Inside Out Legal Aid Foundation. This nonprofit organization was his way of paying it forward, providing pro bono legal assistance to inmates across the country, particularly those fighting wrongful convictions, seeking appeals, or challenging systemic abuses within prisons. The foundation was staffed by a dedicated team of pro bono lawyers, legal students, and volunteers, all inspired by David's story and his unwavering commitment. He frequently returned to various prisons, never Blackwood, to avoid sensationalism and personal baggage, but similar institutions to hold legal clinics. He would sit in stark, utilitarian rooms, just like the one where he had discovered his own talent, patiently explaining complex legal concepts to groups of hopeful, desperate inmates. He taught them about their fundamental rights, about the intricate processes of appeals, and about how to meticulously document their experiences. He empowered them to advocate for themselves, providing them with the knowledge and tools he had so desperately craved during his own incarceration. He often shared snippets of his own journey, not as a hero's tale, but as a testament to perseverance and the power of knowledge, always emphasizing that the system wants you to give up, but hope is the strongest weapon. His influence extended beyond individual cases. David actively lobbied for legislative changes in prison reform, advocating for better access to legal counsel for indigent inmates, more transparent disciplinary procedures, and a reevaluation of sentencing guidelines for minor offenses. He leveraged his own story, sharing it in legislative hearings and public forums, giving a human face to the often abstract issues of criminal justice. He had become a true Ngoy Tro Gyup on a grand scale, ensuring that the dark corridors of prisons would no longer be places where justice went to die, but where it could, with effort and dedication, be resurrected. The story concludes with David, standing before a packed courtroom. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of another human life hanging in the balance. He was delivering a powerful closing argument for another wrongly accused client, a young man from an impoverished neighborhood whose case mirrored David's own in its flimsy evidence and systemic bias. David's voice, no longer timid, but resonant with a quiet passion for justice, filled the room. He spoke not just of legal points, but of the human cost of negligence, the insidious creep of prejudice within the system, and the fundamental right to a fair trial. As he spoke, his gaze swept over the jury, then towards the public gallery. His eyes, once shadowed by isolation and fear, now burned with a quiet, unwavering flame of conviction. He concluded his argument, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a simple, profound statement about the enduring power of truth. The camera, or rather the omniscient perspective, slowly zoomed in on his face, no longer timid and overlooked, but resolute, etched with the wisdom of lived experience and the unwavering commitment to his cause. A single, sunlit beam, cutting through the high courtroom windows, illuminated his face, symbolizing clarity, truth, and hope, a profound testament to a life transformed by the very injustice that had sought to crush it. He had found his second spring, a boundless season of purpose and profound impact, forever fighting for those who long to step from the darkness of confinement into the pure light of freedom. If this story stirred your heart, if it reminds you that courage can alter destinies and that light always finds a path even in the deepest darkness, please leave a comment. Share this story with those who need inspiration. Like, subscribe, and hit the bell to never miss our upcoming stories.